Poetic peeps and gentle persons, betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal, welcome to Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. My name is Damien B Donnelly. This is episode 2, season 9, and it's time to get poetic. Thank you to you, the listeners, for tuning in, whether that's on Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, or even YouTube. We are already rocking our way into season 9. Last time we visited Galway in Ireland, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Delhi in India, and Vancouver Island in Canada. And today we continue our poetic travels with visits to Cardiff in Wales. We have a Californian former teacher of literature and art history now living in Dublin, an actual Dublin writer. And then we head off to the south of France for an Englishman revisiting the podcast for the second time. And I cannot wait to share all of this with you, but just before I do, I'm going to do a call out for 2 special episodes that we have coming up this season. One is coming very shortly, and it will be our Halloween special. And for that, I'm inviting you, the audience, to take part. I am looking for poetry and prose, short stories, flash fiction on the theme of Halloween. So please offer us your tricks, your treats, and scare the bejesus out of us. And then, for Christmas, we'll have our traditional festive party. And again, I'm asking you to share with us your poetic Christmas jingles or your sleigh riding short stories. You have up to 5 minutes for both or either to share your scares or sleigh ride us with the reindeers. And all of this you can send to me at the email address eatthestorms@yahoo.com. And now, with everything that's coming up already announced, let's get back to this episode and let's get travelling. My name is Damien B Donnelly. This is Eat the Storms. Grab your dishes of Kilcannon, your buttered barnbrack, your teas, your coffees or your G&Ts, and let's settle back and enjoy the show. And we are starting off with a Californian West Coaster now based here on the east coast of Ireland in Dublin, whose work includes adult young fiction and historical fiction. She was a teacher of literature and art history, and today you will hear how that has trickled her way into her poetry. She is a founding member of the Baldoyle Writers Group, currently working on her first novel, and today, here to share with us her love of art and ekphrastic poetry. I am so delighted to welcome for the first time to Eat the Storms, Katie Montagna.
Hi everyone, and thank you Damien for inviting me on to Eat the Storms. I'm Katie Montagna, and I'll be reading an ekphrastic poem, which is a type I like as it combines 2 of my great loves, art and literature. This poem is inspired by the painting The Stocking Knitter, circa 1880s, by Sarah Purser, a turn of the 20th century Irish artist, which includes another of my loves, knitting, and which I was fortunate to see at the National Gallery of Ireland in its Sarah Purser Private Worlds exhibition. Free Time, inspired by The Stocking Knitter by Sarah Purser. Sitting and knitting, knitting and sitting, the wool in your hands, the thread of your life. I do not envy you, sitting in your dark room, knitting because you must, socks for your family, or for yourself, or for sale. Though you might find joy in your knitting, you, unlike me, are not knitting for fun. I have no need to work as you do. Labor-saving machines do it for me. Washing machines, microwaves, computers, which you knew nothing of, your life uneased or simplified by. Much better now to knit for fun and recreation, to knit when I want, socks made to fit my feet and nobody else's. Socks that feel like slippers, their good wool a cushion inside my shoes like no store-bought sock. Except, despite this leisured age of machine-assisted everything, I can't always knit when I want to, nor do I have your time for quiet, solitude, peace with my own thoughts. I do envy you. Life moves as fast as your quick fingers flicking yarn around your needles. Instead of putting time into my life, labor-saving device free time into which new tasks are added, speeding life up rather than slowing it down. How desirable to sit alone with my wool and alone with my thoughts in a quiet room, in the quiet of my mind. An ekphrastic poem inspired by the painting Reading, painted by William Connor in 1907. She reads from a book open on her lap, feet propped on the hearth in her kitchen. All is scrubbed clean, bare walls and floors, dishes in their hutch, her own shining hair braided neatly around her head. Cooking and washing are, for this day, done. For these minutes, in a pause between the labors of this day and the next, she reads. Absorbed in her book, chin resting on her hand, she smiles without knowing. Her body softens and curves without knowing into her hardback chair. Her eyes are on her book, but her mind is otherwhere. Words pull her in, carry her out, beyond the kitchen's plain walls, its hutch and washed dishes, scrubbed floor, and grate making do as an ottoman. Her mind travels, her body relaxes, her day eases to its close. In gaps and margins of my life, too, while the kettle comes to the boil, or my web browser stalls and refreshes, or in a luxurious half hour before bed, books carry me away to far-flung and near-to-home places. I've cruised with Poirot on the Nile, rafted with Huck Finn on the Mississippi, messed about in a boat with Rat and Mole on the Thames, and grappled with Santiago on the sea for one last marlin. Now, day's work done, I reach for my book, settle in, and prepare to travel beyond the bounds of my otherwise quite ordinary life, there and back again, before putting out the light on this day, too. Thank you for listening, and thank you again to Damien for having me on Eat the Storms.
And now, from the east coast of Ireland, and a poet originally from the west coast of the United States, we are heading off to visit a Gloucestershire poet now living in the south of France. Another teacher. This is his second visit to the podcast. Last time he was here to share poems from his debut collection, An Array of Vapour, and today I am so pleased that he has come back to read poems from his second collection, published by Whip and Stock, called A Handful of Prayers. Joining us from the south of France, where he lives with his wife Celia and their son Gabrielle, this is Peter Lilly.
It's fantastic for me to be back on Eat the Storms. Last time I read some poetry from my debut collection, An Array of Vapour, and I'm really excited to read some poems from my new collection, A Handful of Prayers. So thank you so much, Damien, for the opportunity. The first poem I want to read from the collection is the first poem in the collection, and it's called Legacy. It was first published in Across the Margin back in 2021. Legacy. There are treasures in my legacy, troves of endless worlds, tightly enveloped in themselves, waiting to be unfurled, to flutter an invitation into dynamism beyond any mere object. Bound in leather and ordered, patiently silent, content to hold their breath and all their secrets of layered wonder until a searcher unfolds them and enters. They have written their interweaving stories onto my double helix and given my feet flight. They have signed their name onto the wet concrete of my foundations. They call from centuries past, and from this very moment, they are always being written, as am I. The main bulk of this collection is made up of a series called Poems and Sonnets for the End of Modernity, and there are a lot of epigraphs that give context to some of those poems. So the first sonnet from that series I'd like to read is one called Your Song, and it was first published in the Fevers of the Mind anthology Hard Rain, Poems in Honour of Bob Dylan. And it has this epigraph from the song A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall by Bob Dylan. I'll know my song well before I start singing. Your song. My crystal memories in frictioned movement ringing, its significance will burn in my bones, a purpose, a path for my feet alone to walk this circled staircase spiraling. Without a third dimension, I'll just trace the melody footprints of my refrain over and over, redrawing my face, retelling my tale, respelling my name. As important as my purpose may be, my ears alone drain its potency, for there is nothing real in a prophecy that can't impact another's melody. So we'll mingle like the notes of the finest wine. I'll know your song well before I start singing mine. The next poem is another sonnet. This was first published in The Bee-Zine, and it's called Revolutionary. And it has this epigraph from Leo Tolstoy. There is one thing, and only one thing, in which it is granted to you to be free in life. All else is beyond your power. That is to recognize and profess the truth. Revolutionary. To be a revolutionary is to let your living make the mightiest noise. Not to write a message of peace in blood or let a movement's leader dictate to you. It's not to find the tribe that fits your voice, but to reject tribalism for good, as a concept and as a condition. You don't prove you're not a pig by grunting in protest against the proposition. You must be changed to be change, to see change, and know the bedrock of what you're wanting beneath the gargantuan mountain range of rough rubble reasons rabble-rousing to the meat of the hope you're espousing. I'd like to read one more sonnet from that series, a sonnet for J.R.R. Tolkien that was first published in the Lothlorien Poetry Journal. It starts with this epigraph from Tolkien. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. Tolkien. It's coming down around me as I write, fingers tapping, shouting in near silence, documenting the divorce of sight and light. Sound bites repeating that plagal cadence, the amen of a time of line stutters, unable to admit its finitude. But order in the midst of chaos mutters of monsters withering the wealth accrued. We are but shrapnel, outraged by the blast that animates us. Our statements are flames, frozen from context in digital frames, from which will emerge the new ruling class. Make your difference tiny, tangible, and slow enough to compose roots in the land. We're going to leave the sonnets behind for the final two poems I'd like to read. This one is called You Are My Music, and it's written for my wife Celia. The poem was written after listening to the Poetry Unbound podcast by On Being, where the host Padraig Tuma reflected on the poem Song by Tracy K. Smith. His reflection led him to speak of the Irish term of endearment, and the Irish listeners are going to have to forgive my pronunciation. Mocheolhu, which he translated as You Are My Music, an Irish way of saying I love you. And that led me to write this poem. The poem also contains the Greek word pneuma, which can be translated as spirit, breath, or wind, depending on the context. And it has this epigraph from the Tracy K. Smith poem Song. I think of your hands pushing off the ledge of the easy quiet dancing between us. You are my music, for Celia. We almost suffocate pushing through that film, separating our youth from our aged rest, where gravity cannot hinder the joy of a thunderous heart's elation. Our souls against all hope wish to remain, yet our bodies feel the irreversible pull of time in cumbersome, wearing pain. And it is in that membrane we live our life, neither here nor there, yearning for the future, yearning for the past, breathing in the now. Yet it is when our bodies meet our souls, we unite in these eternal seconds, moments you can bite into, where the past, future, and now recede like tired dancers from a stage still lit with our music. The instruments and musicians all gone, the stage, the crowd, the ceiling disappearing, the music still growing, shaping, breathing, while the very earth, along with all but sound and pneuma, is become transparent. There we do nothing. We are melody, harmonizing mystery made apparent in a simple Irish term of endearment. Mohioldu, you are my music. I love you. And the final poem I'd like to read was published in Across the Margin, and it's called To My Son at 5 Months. And it's the final poem in my collection. To my son at 5 months. Sweat glitters your forehead from the effort of eating. I can see your heartbeat, pulsating the membrane beneath your translucent hair, white like your Viking mother's. The plates of your skull are still fusing together, still displaying that diamond of vulnerability, an open mind. The sun shines through your pink ears like jellyfish in turquoise water. Your lower lip glistens from vibrating the sound you have just learned. Your heart mouth is open in an innocent curiosity that is too young for etiquette. You push your cheek into my nose as if to embrace some beautiful and incontrovertible realization, as if to embrace the pillow for rest. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my poems. Until next time, stay poetic.
And now, before we head off to Wales, to Cardiff in fact, for our Behind the Storms conversation today, I am delighted to welcome a Dublin writer who I'm very excited to say will also be joining us for the first time in the latest edition of The Storms, our journal of poetry, prose and visual arts, coming this November. This guest has had poems appearing in places like Washing Windows 2, Irish Women Write Poetry, the COVID Verses from Padler Press, the brilliant Bangor Literary Journal, The Honest Ulsterman and Boyne Berries. In 2021, she was shortlisted for the Anthony Cronin International Poetry Award, in 2018 for the Bangor Literary Poetry Competition, and also for the Write by the Sea competition. Her work has appeared in places like RTE Radio 1's Sunday Miscellany programme, and she's written non-fiction pieces for the Irish Independent. Today, she's joining us to share poems from her collection of poetry and short stories called Traces. This is a brilliant Jackie Lynam.
Thanks so much, Damien, for your kind invitation. I'm really honoured to be one of your guests on Eat the Storms podcast. The poems I'm going to read are taken from my collection Traces, which was published in 2023 and deals with themes such as the body, grief, motherhood, music and family. The first poem is called Traces, and it was the first poem I ever had published, and I'll always be grateful to the Bangor Literary Journal for giving me the confidence to keep writing and keep submitting. The stains of womanhood imprinted on a holiday home cushion reawakens those mornings I rushed to cleanse all traces so no one would glimpse my shame, rinsing out sheets in bathroom sinks, from charcoal to crimson to blush then clear. Today, although I scrub with intent, their shape and texture remain steadfast. Mirror images of the footprints on the beach this morning that navigated my New Year stroll, reflecting on all who traced this path and those still to come. Countless women who silently expel, furtively destroying the evidence, indoctrinated from the beginning, natural bodily function, owner discretion required. The next poem is about finding a dress at the top of my wardrobe and figuring out why I had kept it for so many years, even though it doesn't fit me anymore. It's called Precious Cargo, and it was shortlisted for the Anthony Cronin International Short Poem Award in 2021. It shimmies from the top of the wardrobe to the recycling pile and back again, skims my hips, barely touches my thighs, reveals a hint of side boob. Last worn in Greece the night I got the henna tattoo. Over shots of cheap liqueur we plotted marriage and kids and growing old together. The creased photo captures two youngsters, smooth skin, wide-eyed, tanned and tipsy, in love with life and each other. I felt sexy in that dress. There were no sharp tongues in roads to hack me down, taunt and interrogate my flesh, inform me I was too skinny. Barbed comments flung once too often, and I had ingested the mantra, your body is not normal. You must not rejoice in the limbs that move and sway. You tried to teach me a new mantra. You are beautiful. You are beautiful. 3 decades and 4 house moves, yet this cheap satin dress survives. A memento of a sultry summer evening and the taste of ouzo and longing on her lips, and fleeting acceptance of my perfectly imperfect body. I am beautiful. I am beautiful. The next poem I'll read is called Just Salt, and it was written during the pandemic when we had to make difficult choices to keep our loved ones safe. It was published by Arlen House in the Washing Windows 3 anthology. It's a Saturday in February, and I hesitate before I crisscross the city. Essential travel only. Stay home. Stay safe. But she's 80 and alone. And this is probably her last decade, maybe even her final year, and I'm yearning to see her. Just salt, she says when I ring to double check her order. They don't open until 5 and it's cash only, but Macari's chips are worth the wait and the €3 coins fished from handbags and coat pockets. Her muffled voice behind the burgundy door. Hang on, I'm coming. It swings back, my eyes immediately drawn to the paper mask pressed against her skin, her face lit up beneath the covering. Are you staying? Will you have some chips with me? I hesitate again. I better not. I'll take a few and eat them in the car. She points to the black bag she lent me earlier. Keep it in case you're stuck. Fold it back up and leave it in your handbag, she instructs. Don't forget about it. Someday I'll stumble across that carrier and I'll shed salty tears onto its plastic lining and curse the wasted year when I couldn't share chips with my mum, my dear. The next poem is about my dad, who sadly died from Alzheimer's disease, and this poem is called A Time to Remember, which is the name of an album by the Dubliners, who my dad loved. and it was published in Boyne Berries in 2019. It snuck up on you, but it was no childhood game of hide and seek. Questions repeated, deflected, ignored, answered, then answered again, over and over and over. Your body and mind tapping restless, half-eaten meals, newspapers discarded, your troubled eyes and face shadowed by fear. You paced the house day and night, your thoughts tormented every moment. Tap, 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 hammering imaginary nails into tables, your carpentry skills etched in your brain. Had you heard the starter's orders as you sprinted in the garden? I hope you were retracing better times. In death, we reclaimed you. Your beloved running club honoured you. An ode to Tommy read to the packed church. Family, friends, and sporting comrades soothing with stories. The word gentleman mentioned by so many. In time, I recalled your corny jokes and our shared cúpla focal, waltzing around our parlour to the Chieftains and the Dubliners on Sunday mornings after Mass. Those 5 demented years shall not define you. My Elsa Gosha, my darling, my dad. The final poem was written about a very ordinary but enjoyable culture night spent in my kitchen, and it was published by the Martella Journal. It's called September Skies. The weekend sweeps in, and once again the living room's an occupied soccer zone, and the teen girl is scrolling in the unlit lounge. So we sip our whiskies in the kitchen, hot for me with lemon and honey, yours on the rocks. Us in our Friday night best, pink cotton jammies for me, blue checked bottoms and a worn t-shirt for you. It's culture night in Dublin, but from our positions on the groaning grey sofa, we curate our own musical extravaganza, carefully chosen from Brian's list on Spotify. Nick Cave, the Jesus and Mary chain, Kurt Weill, Janelle Monáe. Alas, no flair for stage design. School uniforms and socks clinging to the clothes horse and carelessly strewn across unmatched chairs. There's a 10-cent coin beneath the table for a week now, and the floor is crying out for a mop, the drained pots and pans begging to be put away. But we do none of this. We chat and sing and sway our raised ankles from left to right. Our socked soles caress mid-air, hands held high for the dance tunes, middle-aged gallivanting. Our conversations traverse family, money, jobs, our lack of desire for promotion, but it's always holidays for the chorus. Donegal, America, France. We dream up city breaks, send forth our wishes out into the September sky. Bruges, Budapest, Bordeaux, and then we hit the seas. Copenhagen, Chicago, Cologne. Culture night, Chez nous. Thank you.
And now it's time for my final guest on the show today, and for that we need to go behind the storms, and this storm is bringing us all the way to Cardiff in Wales. For a Welsh poet who is certainly no stranger to Eat the Storms, he has joined us on many occasions, and in particular he was on our first season where he shared poems from his debut collection Spectrum of Flight, which was published by Animal Heart Press, which we'll be talking about very shortly. And of course we will also be talking about his first full-length poetry collection called Dawn's Incision, which was recently published by the brilliant Iceflow Press. His work has appeared in many journals and magazines, including Rust and Bone, Baron Magazine, The Lumiere Review, Trampset, and I'm delighted to say he's also been a contributor to our own Storms journal. Currently, as we're about to hear, he is planning the launch of his next collection, which will be with us next year from Broken Spine Arts, and he is also the co-poetry editor at Broken Spine Arts. I was very happy to sit down with him last week to talk about childhood trauma, bullying, identity, our memories of Derek Jarman movies, homemade lemonade on street corners, and those simple scenes that very often for us become poetic gems. This is Behind the Storms with David Hanlon. David, thank you so much for joining me today for Behind the Storms. It's an absolute pleasure to sit down and talk to you, even if it is over Zoom. I'm going to start off by asking you what I've been asking everybody who's joined me on these little Behind the Storms conversations, and it's about beginnings. So, how did you first get involved in poetry? What was it that sort of enchanted you? And were there early inspirations? Was it a cathartic experience? What were the motivations behind it all?
I didn't really get into poetry until, I would say, it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And it was through a life experience. So I went through a really bad depression in my late 20s. So in that time, I felt, the weakest I'd ever felt, or the most unwell I'd ever felt. And then I came out of it feeling like stronger than I'd ever felt, ever. And I was like, what is that? But not knowing how to understand, couldn't really understand how that had happened. And something in me was just propelled to write about that, to try and understand it. And it just seemed to come out in a sort of poetic form, but I didn't really know a lot about poetry. And then started going to open mic nights. I was also writing some kind of wordplay, funny stuff as well, but it just seemed that the serious stuff kind of took precedence, is that the word?
Was it part of the process of coming out of the depression, going into recovery? Do you think the writing then was also a continuous part of that?
Yeah, I've never really fully thought of it as that in that way, but I guess it sparked my creativity. Which actually is a really unlikely thing you would think would come out of that.
How did it become poetry? How did you sort of find your way then to sort of pen and page?
So I was just writing down thoughts, I guess, and just trying to understand stuff, but it was coming out with metaphor, but it just felt like poetry. It felt like it was coming out in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Although I knew very little about poetry, but I started going to open mic nights, and then I saw Christina Thatcher perform. She's an American poet living in Cardiff as well. And she just was, I hadn't seen anything like it. She was reading from her debut collection, More Than You Were, all about her father's death through addiction. And it was just so raw, so powerful, so vulnerable. And she read it with such, I don't know, ownership, and it just blew me away. It just absolutely blew me away. And that was the moment where I was like, oh my God, other people, it was like when you first see someone else doing something and it gives you that strength to do it yourself. And then I realized then, this is the place for this writing. And and then I approached her and asked her if she would be my mentor.
And had you thought, I wonder, when you started writing down and putting down your ideas onto paper, or the experiences, I wonder, had you thought at that point that this was just sort of a cathartic, solitary experience until you sort of, going out to these spoken word events, hearing Christina, and suddenly you seeing that these things that can often be so personal suddenly have a universal appeal. They have a connection with the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So you're right. Before that moment, I guess it was something so personal, so close to me that, and of course you're going to be guarded around it as well. And that was the moment of, oh, okay, you can do this here and it's okay. And people, it's not just okay, people celebrate it. It was a huge moment. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the pub that I saw her perform in. And it was just one of those moments, where, it really showed, I can do this too.
And I suppose suddenly also you feel like you're part of a community, because I know, like we'll speak about it later on, that we both, in terms of our upbringing, in terms of school, in terms of, identifying as queer or gay at the time, but not really knowing what that meant and going through sort of the bullying that later comes out in your collection. We certainly weren't, our eyes definitely didn't feel a part of any community at that point, but suddenly, you're in this club, you make this connection, Christina's becoming your mentor, you have a community almost, perhaps even for the first time, this relationship with other people outside sort of family, outside the schoolroom.
Yeah, and that's an incredible, that's not something to think lightly, to underappreciate, it's
Yeah.
it's an incredible thing. And yeah, it just provided that space. And I think you get to know people quicker because you're sharing such personal stuff and you're being vulnerable, and then everyone's supporting you, and that just gives you more and more confidence, which is the amazing thing about the community, I think.
Has your writing practice sort of changed since those early days in terms of, I suppose then you weren't necessarily thinking about a collection or,
Yeah.
having a arc. You're just writing whatever is coming out. Now, I think, you've come out with your second collection. So has your practice evolved since then, or is it still, does it have traces of the same thing? Do you need certain music? Do you need a certain space, a certain chair, or a certain pen?
No, I don't think so. So
Uh-huh.
I have I feel like it's almost hard to comprehend because it's almost like a stream of consciousness
Hmm.
kind of process, I guess. I'll just be out in nature and I'll see something like a little moment or yeah, something. I guess like I wrote a poem the other day and it was I turned the corner on my street and they were just these four boys selling lemonade for 50p, like homemade lemonades. And I was like, what? When I've never seen anything like that on my street ever. And it just seemed really, it felt really fit like I was in a movie, like for
Yeah,
that moment. So it struck me so much that I just had to write a poem about it. It just came out. And I think it's those little moments that, yeah, that you just catch and you just feel propelled to write about them.
I just say I do have to ask if you live in 1982 where young boys are selling homemade lemonade on the street corners. That sounds extremely quaint.
I know. Maybe I went back in time somehow for a moment. But the poem actually kind of talks about that. It kind of talks about it feeling like a movie and then kind of being in a movie and then I get to my front door and I finish the drink and I'm back to reality. Almost saying that I don't know, I'm lifted in some way by it.
Well, I suppose that's almost the difference between prose, fiction writing and poetry. Whereas, I suppose when you're focusing on a novel, you're thinking about the characters and their development and their arc. Whereas when you're thinking about poetry, unless you're sort of in the middle of a collection, you're trying to patch things together, it is those very often those glimpses of the everyday that somehow come along and surprise us. And it's not, well, I'm going to sit down in a room for the next hour and write poetry.
Which I just can't do. I've never worked in that way. I've never sat down and thought, right now I'm going to write a poem. It just doesn't work for me in that way. The spark comes and then I'll write it down in my phone. And I might work on it there and then in a hyper state, or I'll just keep it in my phone and then I'll go back to it and I'll try and expand the idea. Yeah, but it's just those moments. And I think it came because I did a film degree. So I think my creativity
Wow.
was nurtured in that. There was a lot of it wasn't practical, it was theoretical. There was a lot of interpreting, camera angles, you know, lots of things in the film world. And I just was very, very creative with that. I would just like read a lot into things. And I think then that transferred over into
Yeah.
my writing.
And you see the cinematic, you can, I suppose now that I know a little bit more about your background, like you see the cinematic in your writing. I think that comes across really evidently. Almost,
Ah,
you get transported when you read certain poems that you have in both of the collections. And I suppose I think about this as well. Like whenever I'm writing a poem, I'm also thinking about what would it look like in a different medium. What would it look like on screen? What would it look like in a painting? And I think when you have explored other forms of creativity, I think suddenly they find ways to sort of overlap and it doesn't just become one thing. It becomes, a film or a movie finding its way onto a page. And I find that very often in your work.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I guess, I have written quite a few poems. I think in my next collection, that hopefully there's going to be quite a lot of poems which have been, which are after movies, written after watching movies. So yeah, I've always had a connection with, I've always loved music and been obsessed with exploring music. And yeah, I think those art worlds do collide.
And it's funny because I remember reading Spectrum, and the poem I think that struck me the most was Derek Jarman's sort of Sebastian. And I think I wrote somewhere about it, and I was saying, I can remember like creeping down the stairs after midnight. My parents were asleep in the house, but you knew that Channel 4 was going to have this sort of, oh, maybe like it's a little gay. I didn't know. No one really even knew what the terms were or how to kind of describe it. And coming down and trying to get a cassette tape and put it in and record it and make sure that it was going to be a cassette tape that no one else was going to watch. But it was just, reading through your collection, it brought that straight back to me. That sort of, that fear, that isolation, because it was like late at night and, it was just shadow and darkness. But at the same time, it was suddenly an identity. It was something, a visibility that I could recognize, even if it was in the middle of the night and it, like I couldn't tell anyone. But I thought, oh my God, like there's a film on the screen from a director who's made something, and I think I might recognize a part of me in there.
I always, that poem holds a really special place sort of in my heart, really, because that was the moment I remember seeing. It's the moment where the two, I can't remember the characters' names, but they're in the sea and they're embracing and they're kissing and they're hugging, and it's kind of in slow motion and it's very close up and it's so tender. It's to me it was like, wow, the camera is like celebrating it.
Yeah.
You feel that. That's what I felt, and for me that was the first symbol of being gay as being something to celebrate, something positive. Nothing had given me that before. All the messages about being gay were negative and so it always stuck in my mind because it had such a profound impact on me because I was able to change my perspective. But I never remembered what the film was. I was really young, and I just always remembered the image. It wasn't until I did my film course that we studied Jarman, and then I came across Sebastian, and then I found that was the film, and I was like, oh my God, this is the film.
Here we go. Yeah.
It had such a profound impact on me. And then I had to write the poem about it.
Yeah. But I think I think you said the word tender earlier on when you were describing the scene. And I think that was for me as well. I remember that tenderness because, like I probably saw it when I was maybe 15 perhaps, and I had no sort of experience of being gay with other people or sex, or I was only coming to terms with it, even if I was coming to terms with it myself. But what I had sort of heard about it or talked about it was this sort of seedy, like dirty, underground, rough, alternative thing. It wasn't soft and tender and beautiful, and suddenly that's what this scene was. It was, and I remember just being mesmerized. Like this is what they have in the romantic movies that they play in the light, when it's a man and woman. I didn't realize that like two men could be the same thing. It didn't have to be like rough against rough. It was tender and beautiful. But
it's amazing that we have that, that we have that in common, that one scene from this one film has had such an impact on both of us. It's amazing.
I'd say thanks to Channel 4 and BBC 2 in the 80s, willing to kind of, even if it was late at night, to share it. But maybe let's just focus maybe a little bit on Spectre before we come into your new collection. So your debut collection that was brought out with Animal Heart Press, it brings both yourself and the reader back in time to confront perhaps a childhood and adolescence of beatings, of bullyings, of learning to swim, and ultimately to survive. I was looking over a review I did of it when I first read it, and I think I said something like David Hanlon has learned to be a great swimmer, not by choice. He has also become, possibly also not by choice, but by need, an exceptional poet, a documentary filmmaker with a pen as his camera and a raw, broken, battered, but partially intact vulnerability that raises this collection to a mind-blowing lesson in survival that every school should be lucky enough to teach their students who are still trembling and drowning and dying in those often too cold corridors. And everything about it echoed to me some relationship with my pastor, something that I had experienced. I was wondering what it was like for you to go back through those corridors, through that time, to write this. Was it written as a necessity? Because to share all of these things as a closeted queer kid sort of from the 90s, these were things that we learned to hide.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're putting it all out there on a page with all the vulnerability, but all the hurt and all the pain. So how was that? Was that a traumatic experience to go back?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you again for that really kind review of the book. Yeah, I mean, it was so scary. It was it's my first collection. I haven't really gone in, I've gone in deep, let's say, very deep.
Yeah.
And I was terrified. Throughout the process. I still get terrified because it is so personal, and people tend to keep that stuff private, and it's scary to put your whole private world out there. But I think what gave me the strength was the community, was seeing these other people, other poets doing it, and just admiring their bravery, and and that would give me strength to write. One of the first collections I read was Andrew Macmillan's Physical. And the way he talked about, it was so open about being a queer man, and not feeling masculine and looking at masculinity. And it just gave, those pressures are still on us, and I think poetry has helped me to become way more comfortable with myself and not needing to be, feeling like I need to be masculine, or just that it's amazing the transformation that it gives you when you write about this personal stuff. And I think what ultimately made me keep going and releasing it is that I just thought, this is important, this stuff is important. Whenever I would hear people read about any sort of topics with stigma attached to them, I always found it so powerful, so important, because it's changing the narrative, isn't it? It's changing the way we look at things. And that's what I wanted my poetry to do, if it could reach out and help somebody to, I don't know, to embrace themselves, to overcome their own challenges, then that would be the best thing. And the best thing that's come out of all of this is that my friend and my poet friend Alan Parry, who is the editor of Broken Spine, which I'm also the poetry editor for, his son felt comfortable to come out because of hearing my poetry, and that for me that's the greatest thing of all.
But it's the bravery of you putting yourself out there, of putting everything that you've gone through out there, but with that hope of, yes, it will help. Before we came on air, we were talking about Heartstopper, and in a similar way, there are times where Heartstopper makes me really angry, because I want that to be my childhood in the 80s, and not, the childhood that it was, where nobody sort of knew anything. And, even if I was bullied and called, gay or faggot, no one knew what those words even meant at that point. It was just a slang term. It was just, they were trying their best to sort of beat me in whatever way they could. But Heartstopper, even today, the point of its relevance today is that it still is daring, and it still is trying to change the narrative. We're making steps, but it's not completely, the fact that we are shocked, I think, and surprised to see it prime time, it's Netflix, but it still needs, things still need to change, and we still need to see more of ourselves and more things that people, visions that we can relate to, that we can think, yeah, we're a part of it. We're a part of not just the narrative, but we're a part of everyday life.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's tremendous then when, those around us and their children, of course, then see a way out.
Yeah.
So congratulations.
Thank you. And it was also for my own journey as well. I hadn't fully overcome all this stuff. I don't know if you ever if you ever do, but as much as it was scary and vulnerable, it's helped me to be stronger in, my identity as a gay man and
Mhm.
the journey of acceptance. It's also helped me, of course.
Yeah.
Um,
And that whole thing of being closeted, like I said earlier, we, were taught, not sort of directly, but we were taught indirectly to hide everything, to put
yeah,
everything away, to not be open, to not be sexual, to not have a desire.
yeah,
Um, and to suddenly then to be able to say, oh my God, like this is it. But in with having the right to say, I have these desires and this is who I am, I think we also need to be able to say, but there's a kid inside who also wants to say that he wishes that this could have been, there's still
yeah,
that, to unleash, I suppose, the hurt or those yeah, everything that became before. Because I remember when I was reading Spectrum of Flight, there was a huge part of me that went through the trauma again and needed
mm,
to go through the trauma as an adult.
yeah, yeah. And I think you're right. Yeah, I think you made me realize something there that we were taught to hide it. And as you grow older, you realize that how wrong that was, and you feel angry. Um, and that anger can be directed in the right way. And in this way, it's I'm making up for that, I'm
Yeah.
that's what's making me want to do it even more because it's like this should have happened. This should have been okay back then.
Hmm.
So I'm going to give
Hmm.
it to you now, how it
Yeah.
should have been. However, how everyone else gets to just be them. Um, but for gay people, it's not the same.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think it's interesting in both because I think with both your collections, so first one with Animal Heart Press and now with Ice Flow Press, both international, none of them from Wales, both international. But I think you had these fantastic supporters. So you have Ellie Horan, who's always going to be by your side. I think a fantastic poet, a fantastic publisher, and a fantastic support. And I imagine she was also, instrumental in her encouragement of you to sort of to bring Spectrum of Flight to fruition, to open that cage and let it soar.
Yeah, because she said she just read the first poem and she just knew she wanted the collection,
Uh-huh.
and I didn't know her at that time, but once I got to know her and her work, it's just incredible. It's so raw, so powerful. It's
Yeah.
on another level. She's so strong. It's amazing the places she goes to, and
Hmm.
we have that in common that we're both exploring these deep, sometimes painful, personal, really personal things. And when we toured together, we became so close. I only met her. I've only actually met her that one time
Uh-huh.
in flesh, and we got so comfortable as we were going around touring that we would read each other's poems and actually would read the poems that we felt too scared to read ourselves. So it just showed, that level of trust
Trust.
to allow
Yeah.
someone else to read that was incredible. It was amazing.
And
Um,
you have that like so the new collection, Dawn's Incision. Again, I had the chance to read it. I got to write a blurb. Again, thank you so much.
yes, thank you
It's
very much.
always so exciting to to read something before it's completely on the shelf. Um, I think so things to sort of say about craft and consideration, this examination of lust, of love, of loss, of living beyond all the legacies. Lamentations chiseled by an artist of words into fine forms. once weavers of tapestries across our beds and the nests of our desires. These are accomplished, passionate portraits of love as forest, as fire, as flight, coming back up from the fall. And then Alan Parry, who, we've just been talking about there, poet and of course head of Broken Spine Arts, he said it was profound exploration of common humanity. And again, so you have Robert and Moira of Ice Slow Press. It feels like, having been at your launch and heard Robert talk about the journey of Dawn's Incision, it feels like this became a truly collaborative experience. And again, they were nurturers who continued with you on this journey. Am I right in sort of in thinking that?
Yeah, I mean, the journey for this, when I think about it, when I think back, some of these poems were 8 years old, some of them, right from the beginning when I was writing, and some of them were very early on anyway, and some of them, have been written within the last year. And yeah, Moira and Robert were amazing, so supportive. They gave so much time and energy. And it wouldn't be the book it is today without their support. I remember submitting to them, and it was just a short collection, and all it was very short poems. I think it was like a micro chapbook, and it was just the loss. It was just the grief, because when I started writing, the first poems I wrote about in this collection were after I'd broken up with my partner. So just coming out of the depression, and then we broke up not long after. So then I went from writing about the depression to writing about our breakup and the grief. I was in that grief place, and then I'd gotten through the grief, but I'd never gone back and written anything else on it. So it was just these poems from that time, of grief. And Moira was like, it's great, but we would love you to expand it and go back and tell us more about the journey. And so, the poems, about the love and the tenderness when we were together, they're all written from very recently. So they're not actually written at the time, So I was able to go back and access those memories. And then at the same time, I was able to write about where I was at that point as well, where I've healed, and I was really realizing all the things I still had and all the things my partner had given me that I was moving forward with. So I was able to write, a lot of poems of the recovery as well. So then it just became so much more fleshed out, Yeah, and I have them to thank. It wouldn't be the collection it is if they hadn't encouraged me to do that.
And I love that you were, the beginning came at the end. Like you had the ending first and then the beginning came. But I think it's also interesting because I don't know whether, I just writing about morbid things or broken things, but when at the height of romance or at the early days of romance or, in the big love, I feel like I'm always so preoccupied being in it and like riding that wave that I never think about, I need to write about this. I was reading through both of them last week, and it's extraordinary when you read Spectrum and then you move on to Dawn's Incision. And Spectrum is so, we're so put upon, you as the writer, but also us as the reader, because we take the journey with you. But then you come to Dawn's Incision and you see this whole experience of life and love, that at times in Spectrum you didn't think was ever going to be possible. And I suppose at times for all of us who've gone through sort of, a closeted period or a period of just depression where we didn't think it was going to be any lighter or anything was possible, then suddenly you have your second collection and it feels almost like this sort of shining beacon of like maybe even a two fingers up to everything that happened in the past, of like, here I am, I've lived, you tried to knock me, you tried to bully me, put me down, but I've risen, Phoenix from the ashes, out of the cage. I don't know whether that was intentional or it was just something that struck me when I was reading the two of them and comparing them.
Yeah, I think, the relationships in my life are so important, because when you come from that young age of receiving so much hate for who you are and who you love, the type of person that you love, um, then yeah, when I'm older and I'm able to have this relationship and actually be loved and show love, um, it's a huge deal, and it is kind of, you're finally getting the thing you never thought you could have, that no one
Yeah.
wanted you, that it felt like no one wanted you to have. Um, and yeah, and then I wanted to do a whole book on it. Yeah.
And can I ask in part, I suppose I'm asking because I've also come through it myself, and you can tell me if I'm being too nosy, but when these are all things I suppose that we kept to a degree from those closest around us, even if it was like good friends or certainly family. And suddenly, here we have two collections. One is about what, childhood and growing up and adolescence was like, and two, it's, the flip sides of love and everything that happens afterwards. Was there a reaction from family? Was it difficult to share what it was like?
Yeah, very challenging
Uh-huh.
to just because it's so personal, isn't it? I think anybody would struggle with that. But they've both been really supportive. They've read the book. They have, I've given them copies. Yeah, and it just made me realize that you don't need to worry as much as you think. You start to accept more, and you start to care less what people think, maybe, as well, which is good.
Talking about journeys and coming on, like you've mentioned yourself, sub-editor at the Broken Spine Arts. How did that happen? How's it coming along? What have you been doing with them?
So I'm the co-poetry editor there with Katie Jenkins. Yeah, I met Alan, Harry, when I was touring my book, Spectrum of Flight. They were releasing, I think it was the first Broken Spine collection. So Alan and Paul had recently, set this up, and it was an amazing night. And me and Elizabeth performed. Yeah, we just kept in contact, and then yeah, I was given this opportunity, and it's been amazing to take on that role. Like I've never done that before. So to read poems and have submission periods and then read all these poems is such an honor to get to read all that work, I guess.
Yeah. And you get to appreciate it as well. You get to appreciate, how stressful submissions can be. And, even I suppose, like, now editing the journal, you see submissions coming in, and sometimes, like people have not used the font that you asked, or, instead of everything coming in one document, they're coming in 6 documents. But it's that thing of like, there's so much pressure, and, you're trying your best, but there's always something that you might overlook. And you realize, oh God, we're all capable of making, of missing things or making these mistakes. But, if the writing's, I always think, but if the writing's good enough, it's fine. What's coming up next? Like you mentioned earlier on, there was another collection in the works, possibly about movies and a drastic sort of thing.
Yeah, so it will be coming out with Broken Spine. That one is the collection that is exploring my depression.
Yeah.
So, again, it will literally be some of the first poems I ever wrote, but also ones more recently. And really that collection, I kind of realized that it's an ongoing one, because it's all about, mental health and mental well-being. And, as you could say, I'm always in recovery. So I'm always developing and growing. So there's always stuff to write about that's connected to theme of the book. It will be called Headroom. Yeah, it's going to be very, very deep, very, very going to be painful. It's going to be hard, but it will be positive as well, as both my books have been.
As both are, like, it's nothing.
Yeah,
this is what we're expecting from you. We're not expecting an easy read.
Yeah, well, that's good then, because but again, it feels incredibly vulnerable. I think that actually, strangely, the most recent book I released felt the least scary. This one just feels, I don't know, really, really vulnerable. But that's good, because that means, I will grow and I'll become more accepting of it. And again, there's so much stigma around mental health, and that's something if I can play a part in tackling that, then then that's what I would love to do. So hopefully it will do that.
I think it's vital that you have this collection coming out. And David Hanlon, thank you so much for joining me today on Behind the Storms. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, it's been lovely talking to you, Damien. Yeah, really great. Thank you very much.
And now I'm delighted to say David is going to read some poems from Dawn's Incision.
I think I'll start with the opening poem. So this is called Changes, and it's the opening poem from the collection. Faster than a hummingbird's wings, you're gone, and I'm here, slack-jawed. How much loss can be felt from a single wing beat? I'm left unhinging myself to a morning, breaking at sunset. I pine for Arctic summers, midnight sun. But then I remember, in winter lies complete darkness. I hold the thick night sky between my teeth, trying not to forget how many times I've been awakened in this darkness. That's the first poem.
Weight of slack-jawed in that sort of flight, suddenly that slack-jawed, even how you pronounce it, like it's like a pounding in the chest. It's like such a punch.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it's always good to read the opening poem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go for this one. Luck is a flower. In your tall room, I proclaim we are so lucky, and you accord. I love it when you say that. At the wall that's all windows, you lean and bolt, half open, so I won't get too cold, like you always do. Light your roller, smoke ribbons, vanishing into night's inky district. Still in your bed, I pull your quilt close, closer. Study the floral design, its tapestry.
Such tenderness, like such lightness, like it's extraordinary that balance that you sort of dance quite a lot. And when you get these love poems, these romantic poems, there's such a passion, but there's such a lightness to them as well. And also, I suppose this sense of, at times, this sense that, like it can blow out really quickly.
Yeah.
The flame is lit, but see it.
And it's so different. It's amazing how you realize how your writing develops, because the first book was so sprawling and just so dense, whereas this one is it's very concise and more economical, and it's just very different. I think a different experience, to which I like that we grow and things change.
I think you make a very beautiful use of the page here, and you give, I think we often forget about the blank space and the importance of sort of blank spaces, or whether it's pauses or room for breath. And I think you see that very much in Dawn's Incision, that sense of balance between words and breath, word and space.
Would you like me to read any more?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, this one is called Camp Out at Music Festival. We arrive in this Czech town, put up our tent. The sun retracts behind sharp hills. Quickly bugs invade in swarms, seize our space like usurpers. You devote time and energy trying to usher them out. All I want is for you to stop. Talk to me.
Now, just before we finish up today, I'm going to leave you with poems. And as I first met Katie, my first guest on today's show, when I was facilitating an ekphrastic poetry workshop last year in the library in Howth, I'm going to read 2 ekphrastic poems. And following on from the conversation that I had with David Hanlon today in terms of our growing up, our figuring out who we were in the midst of the bullies who surrounded us, I'm going to stick with 2 poems that continue on that theme. So the first one is called The Retreat, early on, and it's after Man of Head Going Senile, painted by Paul Klee in 1922. The Retreat, early on. First day of school. First glimpse of what it's like to be eaten slowly. There is no room for insecurity in the playground. You must learn this quickly, but no one will tell you this until it is too late. There are beasts in the jungle of the yard, hungry to swallow up all that others haven't learned has value. By lunchtime, you will have taught yourself to remove pieces in order to preserve. As poet, I start with the mouth in order to hone words, like edges of blades, a Kruger on the inside of a Care Bear. Build unspoken sentences, march them like inner armies while tackling external corridors. By the second day, wear only one eyebrow. Drop the left eye below the right. Remove both ears. Anything that can be a hook or can hear. Paint yourself with the yolk of a stale egg. Banish any hint of perfection. Too young to know you'll never be able to reclaim this upon release. And the last poem I'm going to leave you with, another poem inspired by art, a ekphrastic poem. This time it's inspired by the painting The Plank Road by Jack B. Yeats, and this is called Not All Birds Are Equal. It was cold beyond the rainbow, on the other side of the illusion that all things were equal. We built our own village in the end, painted ourselves into shadow after the show to make it home without being seen. Blue skies and blackbirds, born to adjust, looking to nest. A wing could be a weapon. Home was not rooted in the rock upon which we were first ruined. We grew claws, but were never crows. There are planks to walk, even on land. We tiptoed like Tinkerbells across rooftops, twinkled in the downtime of your equality, shone in basements, gutters, ghettos, till our cells became your trends, our blaze, your brand. It is cold still on this side of the rainbow, on the far side of the reality that nothing can ever really be equal. There are roads, planks, colours, and then the blue, the deepest of all, that can freeze. There are blackbirds born to adjust, and crows who come out to claw. Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal. We've reached the end of another episode of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm your host and producer, Damien B Donnelly, on platforms like Deep Breath, Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Prime, Podcasts, and even YouTube. Thank you so much to my guests on today's show, who have been David Hanlon, Jackie Lynam, Peter Lilly and Katie Montagna. For details on all of my guests, head on over to our website, eatthestorms.com, click on the podcast section called Listen to the Podcast, and there you'll find a blog post for every episode. This was episode 2, season 9, and in there you'll find photos, bios, social media handles, and ways to find, follow and be fans of all my fantastic guests on the show today. Now, while you're there, you will also find details on The Storms, our journal of poetry, prose and visual arts. And if you haven't picked up a copy already, then I can tell you that issue 1, 2 and 3 are currently on sale as a bundle, and in the coming weeks we'll be taking pre-orders for our 4th issue. This is going to be a very special issue supported by Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, a part of Dublin City Council, and also Fingal Arts, a part of the Fingal County Council. And the theme of this new issue is Dublin Days, from city to shore and across the sea. One city, 93 voices and visions. We'll be having our launch on the 10th of November at our Gillen Castle. We'll be having a Zoom launch for international contributors on the 13th of November on a Wednesday evening. And of course, Eat the Storms will be providing an audio platform for the audio companion to the journal on Saturday, the 16th of November. Meanwhile, as I said, we have our call out for 2 special episodes upcoming on the podcast, our Halloween and Christmas editions, where you are invited to share poetry or prose for up to 5 minutes. And the email address for that, as I said at the beginning, is eatthestorms@yahoo.com. Now, that's it from me. It's been a really busy week. The podcast may have opened up again last week, but while it returned, I was on the road to Waterford with thanks to the wonderful Gerard Duffy, where I read at the Poetry Lounge from my new collection, Back From Away, which was published by Tourist Press, alongside fellow poets and readers Kath McKay and my dear friend Amy Barry. I was also interviewed by the very thoughtful, considerate and exceptionally talented Frank Farrelly, whose own collection is coming out next month, and I got to finally meet, despite car trouble due to a dodgy clutch, Catherine Ronan, a previous guest on Eat the Storms, the dearest Martina Dalton and the wonderful Krista De Bruyne. This week, I had the joy of sitting down with Linda McKenna and Gustav Parker Hibbett, where we were all interviewed by fellow poet Patrick Deely at the Red Line Book Festival in Castletimon Library, thanks to Mark Ward. A huge thank you to all of the Red Line Book Festival committee for their invitation. Now, that evening also featured the results of the Red Line Book Festival poetry competition, and lo and behold, I'm delighted to say that the winner of the competition was Ger Duffy for her exceptional poem Testimony of Soap, in memory of the testimonies of those who were incarcerated in the mother and baby homes in Ireland. Congratulations, Ger. I'm also delighted to say that I had the pleasure of hearing the illuminating Doreen Duffy read her poem, which was shortlisted for this year's competition, along with Fionnuala Cahill, another shortlisted writer who will be joining us for the first times in the Storms Journal next issue. Now, tomorrow I'm going to try and take a break and rest and relax. I know this will never happen, but hey, it's always good to have hope. And in the meantime, I wish you as much time as possible that you can possibly take to catch your breath, to repose, to regroup, to get ready to catch as much light as possible on this journey into the deep days of winter. Although isn't the moon just astonishing right now? This is Damien B Donnelly. You've been listening to Eat the Storms, and until next time, please, whether you're a blazing sun or a mystical moon, make sure you all stay